Welcome to Australia's Environment in 2019. In this briefing, we will tell you about the conditions that occurred in Australia's environment last year. We have summarized large amounts of satellite station and survey data, and we've interpreted those data using our Oswald system. We have augmented those data with reports from Australian and overseas agencies. And a national summary report and report cards for all regions can be found online on this website. In this briefing, we'll cover the following topics. We'll talk about the global context, oceans, people, weather, fire, water, soils, vegetation, biodiversity, and finally we look at a number of summary indicators. Global change continued unabated in 2019, and the ozone hole was smaller than previous years. Atmospheric CO2 continued to increase rapidly by 2.5 ppm. That is 14% slower than the previous year, but still 12% faster than the average over the 2000-2018 period. Average CO2 concentration was 411 ppm. That means a 30% increase from 1960. Global air temperatures continued to be high. Global temperature was 0.8 above the 1960-1990 mean, and it was the second highest in the historical record. The ozone hole shrunk. The ozone hole was 58% smaller than the previous year, and this was due to an unusual polar air circulation pattern. Sea ice continued to decline. The extent on both hemispheres was the lowest since 1978, and the combined extent was 7% lower than in the previous period. In summary, global warming continued apace, but the ozone hole was unusually small. Australia's population continued to grow rapidly in 2019. Population reached 25.5 million, and that is 17% above the 2000-2018 average. However, population growth slowed slightly in the last year. Growth was 365,000, which is slightly less than the previous 3 years, but the increase continued and remained driven by net immigration. Demand for space and materials fell. The number of building approvals fell for the 4th year in a row. However, new dwellings do not always involve land cover change and can replace already existing dwellings. Greenhouse gas emissions remained very high last year. They decreased 0.1% from the previous year, but they're still 5% above the 2000-2018 average. There were decreases from the previous year in agriculture due to the floods and drought, in electricity generation and in transport. However, these were almost entirely offset by increases from oil, gas and mining. They include fugitives, direct combustion and industry emissions. The official government statistics suggest that land cover and land cover change led to a net uptake of greenhouse gases in 2019. The accounts state that 19 million tons of CO2 equivalents were taken up due to planted forest gains exceeding the accounted forest removals. However, this number excludes large natural emissions from drought and fire. The emissions per person fell slightly. They were 1.6% lower than the previous year and 11% below the 2000-2018 average. The greatest decreases occurred in agriculture and electricity, and the greatest increases once again were from oil, gas and mining. Per capita emissions in Australia remained among the highest in the world. There were 20.8 tons per CO2 equivalents per person in 2018, and that is 1.2 times that in the US, 2.5 times that in the EU, and 3.3 times the world average. Australian emissions are high due to a combination of high energy use, the use of coal, and non-CO2 emissions, including from agriculture. In summary, Australia's population continued to grow steadily, and with it, the use of natural resources and environmental pollution also continued to grow. Global ocean temperatures continued to rise. The oceans absorb 93% of excess heat from climate change, That shows in our records, which continue to climb. A new record was set in 2019, continuing a clear trend of ocean warming. Sea level also continued to rise, and the global sea level rose by 6.2 millimeters in 2019. That is 72 millimeters since 2000 and 95 millimeters since 1993. Sea level around Australia has been rising faster than a global average. The rise was fastest in the Tasman Sea, which has been rising at about 150 millimeters or 15 centimeters since 1992. Australian ocean temperatures were a little bit lower than the previous year. They were 0.09 degrees below the 2018 average and well above the 1960-1919 average still. No marine heat waves occurred in 2019. However, it was the third warmest year in the Tasman Sea. Cool conditions northwest of Australia from June onwards corresponded to a strong positive Indian Ocean dipole event. The Great Barrier Reef remains in poor condition. No marine heat waves or mass bleaching occurred. Poor condition remained in the northern reef, deteriorating in central and southern reef areas with continuing starfish outbreaks. In summary, no marine heat waves occurred last year, but the Great Barrier Reef remains in poor condition. Thank you, and Luigi Renzullo will now talk about the weather in 2019.
– 2019 was both the driest and warmest year in Australia's recorded history. National average rainfall was the lowest in recorded history, with only 229 millimetres of rainfall on average falling across Australia. Rainfall was 29% lower than previous years and 40% lower than the previous 19 years on average. Much of Australia recorded its lowest rainfall on record. The only variations to this are in Queensland, which was subject to some flooding in the middle of the year, and in Western Tasmania. But generally, the picture for Australia was we received the lowest rainfall in 119 years. In terms of the temperature, 2019 added to the trend we've been seeing for some time now of a gradual increase in temperatures. The average temperature across Australia was 0.85 degrees above the previous 19-year average and 1.52% above the 30-year average from 1961 to 1990. Maximum temperatures were extremely high. Average maximum temperature across the country was 43.6 degrees Celsius, which is 1.8 degrees Celsius above the previous 19-year average. Heat records were smashed across the country. March and December particularly stood out. For 2019, the number of days that were above 35 degrees Celsius was the highest in recorded history, with 106 hot days in 2019. This is 36% higher, or 28 days more, than the previous 19 years average. Overnight temperatures, the minimum was lower than 2019, but still 2.2 degrees higher than the average for the previous 19 years. Regionally, when we look at the number of frost nights, there is some variation, but generally across Australia, we had average conditions. The only variations to this are pockets of southern Australia, around South Australia-Victorian border, and in central Queensland. Snow cover for 2019 was 19% more than 2018. There was some unseasonal snow that fell in November in Tasmania. The dry conditions and the unprecedented fire season led to a lot of air quality issues from dust and smoke. This was particularly bad for New South Wales and the ACT around December, where the number of days where the air quality index of PM 2.5 exceeded its safety threshold was between 14 and 32 days on average across New South Wales. That's the worst since 2000. In summary, 2019 was extremely hot and dry. And now, to talk about the fire conditions across Australia, I pass to Marta Yebra.
2019 will be remembered as the year of bushfires. Early in the year, we have fires happening in Tasmania and Victoria, and the 1920 fire season starting as early as September in Queensland and northern New South Wales, and then follow in South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria. Nationally, the fire activity was average. We only have in the order of tenths below the 2000-2018 average, and only a slightly greater activity than in 2018. However, we show a strong regional differences when we look at the fire activity by different bioregions. So activity was below or average across most of the inland due to very low fuel loads, but the activity was the highest since at least 2000 in Tasmania, the East Coast and parts of Western Australia. In terms of total burnt area, this was below average and slightly lower than the previous years. When looking at the burn extent by major vegetation types, Australia's wet forests were impacted heavily. However, other areas like open forest and woodland have a reduced burn area in comparison with previous years. New South Wales and Tasmania were the states that experienced highest increase in burn extent in comparison of our study period of time. An interesting feature of 2019 was a combined dryness and heat waves records, and this led to a very dry vegetation across Australia. Even the areas that are in light blue in the map correspond to forests that were with fuel moisture content values below critical moisture conditions. Nationally, then, the fuel was the driest since 2000. When it comes to the total fire carbon emissions, these were above average. And unusually, most of the emissions were in forest fires. And regionally, there were differences where New South Wales and Tasmania recorded the highest emissions. In summary, the fire activity was low in northern Australia, but unprecedented in southeast Australia.
Nationally, river flows were very low in 2019. Total inflows were 52 millimetres or 407,000 gigalitres. That is 43% below the 19 years before that, and 22% less than the previous year. Flows were extremely low in many catchments. They were the lowest since at least 2000 in the Darling Basin, along the southeast coast, and in the Timor Sea Basin. They were well above average, however, along northern Queensland coast, around Karratha and around Strahan. There were major floods in Queensland. Floods occurred from the Gulf to Townsville due to persistent heavy rainfall in January and February. An estimated 600,000 cattle perished in the floods. And there were further cyclone-related floods later in the year. There were floods around Karratha and Port Hedland due to Cyclone Veronica, and there was further flooding around the Channel Country due to Cyclone Trevor. 2019 saw declines in the major irrigation reservoirs. The Murray-Darling Basin fell from 47 to 35% of capacity, and the Ord Reservoir fell from 61 to 34% of capacity. We also saw declines in urban water storages. Sydney fell 80% from 2018, Brisbane by 25%, and Canberra by 26%. There were also severe declines in many rural water supplies, particularly in New South Wales. The extent of wetland flooding was low in 2019. Total inundation fell for a third year, which was the lowest extent since 2002, and 26% below 2000 to 2018 average. In many catchments, wetland extent was the lowest since at least 2000. That includes much of Western Australia, Northern Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin. Conditions in Lake Eyre Basin were normal and above average in Northern Queensland and Western Tasmania. In summary, river flows were very low, with few flood events, declining water storages and drying wetlands. Back to Luigi Renzullo, who will talk about soils.
Perhaps not surprisingly, having the hottest and driest conditions means that our soils were extremely dry. Nationally, the top 6 metres of soil water availability fell to the lowest since 2000. That's 30 millimetres or 11% less than 2018 levels. And that's 11% less than the 19-year average previous. Regionally, the story isn't so good. Most of the country saw a general decrease from previous years, with the exceptions being Queensland, because of the mid-year flooding, and parts of central New South Wales. Compared to 2018, 2019 showed a general trend of decreasing soil moisture at a much higher rate than previous years. This was due to the unusually dry and warm conditions in winter and spring. Northern Australia also experienced a decrease in soil moisture. This is due to a relatively weak monsoon and late arrival of the monsoon in Northern Australia in the 2019-20 period. In contrast, central Queensland experienced an increase in average soil moisture conditions. High rainfall in the area in February and March resulted in a general increase in soil moisture for that region. Soil protection by vegetation and litter was very poor across Australia. Exposure reached levels not seen since 2000. That's 13% greater than the 19 years previously and 10% greater than the previous year, 2018. The extremely poor soil conditions across inland Australia were the worst seen since 2000. This is particularly noticeable in New South Wales, southern Queensland and north Western Australia. So the poor protection led to severe dust storms. Dust storms caused damage to agricultural land, infrastructure and human health. Dust storms occurred in February in southeast Australia, April in South Australia, May in Victoria, November in New South Wales. In summary, soil moisture conditions reached lowest levels in southeast Australia. Poor soil moisture conditions led to an increase in dust storm activity. And now, back to Albert van Dijk.
National vegetation condition was the poorest since 2002. It was 7% lower than the previous year and 10% below the 2000 to 2018 average. Vegetation was especially poor across much of inland Australia. It was the poorest since at least 2000 in northeast New South Wales, southeast Queensland and much of the arid interior. Vegetation growth rates were also the lowest since 2002. Vegetation growth, that means carbon uptake, was estimated from weather and satellite data by a Roswell system, and it was down 10% on 2018 and 17% below the average for the previous 19 years. However, growth conditions were good in some of the northern regions, especially around the coast of the Top End and Cape York. Farming conditions were a little bit better than the previous year, but still quite poor overall. Vegetation productivity was down 32% on grazing land, 28% in irrigation land, and 24% in dryland cropping. And it was slightly better than 2018, mainly because of the improved conditions in Victoria. Productivity of forests and natural environments also declined. Native and plantation forestry declined 12%, below the average for the 2019 years, and natural environments 19%. National tree cover fell for a second year. The cover fraction of vegetation greater than 2 meters declined for a second year to reach 13%, or 8 million hectares less than the previous year, and 8% less than the 2018 average. Drought and fire helped to reduce tree cover right across the country. There were the greatest losses in the New South Wales-Queensland border region, and nationally the greatest losses occurred on natural environments and on grazing land. Fires particularly impacted the wet forest of New South Wales. 80% of the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area and 53% of the Gondwana Rainforest World Heritage Area was burned. Many vulnerable vegetation types were affected, including 35% of rainforest, 41% of wet sclerophyll forest, and 53% of heathlands. It's unclear how well the vegetation will be able to recover from these fires. In summary, vegetation condition was poor for a second year, with relatively below average farming conditions and falling tree cover. To talk about biodiversity, I'll now hand over to Shoshana Rapley.
So what do these trends in the environment mean for Australia's biodiversity? In a nutshell, 2019 was very challenging for Australia's flora and fauna. Whilst Australian species have evolved to cope with Australia's climate, the extent and severity of the climatic conditions we experience have been pushing them to their limits. Currently, we don't have any comprehensive way to survey Australia's species, so in lieu of that, we use some metrics for biodiversity. These include the threatened species listing, looking at subgroups of species that might tell us about communities as a whole, using citizen science data that can show areas that otherwise don't be surveyed, and using disturbance mapping from remote sense data. The threatened species listing is currently the closest we have for accounting Australia's species and how they're faring in the extinction rates. The list has been rising steadily since its inception in the year 2000. In 2019, the additional 40 species we listed increased the list by 2%, and it's up by 36% since the year 2000, with no signs of a negative trend yet. Having added another 40 species, we're now up to 1,890. And for all of those species, just about, we have conservation advice for 97%, which means to some extent we understand the threats that are challenging those species and what might need to be done. However, we only have recovery plans for 41%, which actually dictates a plan and timeline of how we can restore those species' population trajectories. Diving a bit deeper into what happened with species in 2019, we had 9 species downlisted, which meant they were either removed from the list completely or moved categories, for example, from endangered to vulnerable. An example of this is the coastal Tenodus, which is a robust lizard. There were lots of targeted surveys undertaken and more populations were found of this skink. Often when species are downlisted, it's because more information is found, but more often it's because there's been a taxonomic change. So a species that existed before by itself is lumped in with another species and is no longer listed. We had 33 species added to the list completely. This includes the white-throated needletowel, which is the world's fastest bird. With species that span huge ranges like this, they are really, really hard to monitor, first of all, and secondly, to conserve. 7 species were uplisted within the rankings, so they moved from a category, for example, from endangered to critically endangered. Of the uplistings and the additions, 12 of these species were frogs. In 2019, 2 species became extinct. So one of these was a flower, which is a poorly known species from WA's claypans. It hasn't been seen in 30 years and was listed in WA as extinct in 2017, and the federal listing reflected this in 2019. Likewise, the Bramble-K mellimus is a species that officially went extinct in 2016, made the news again in 2018 where the government recognised that extinction and was officially added to the extinct list in 2019. The Bramble-K mellimus is particularly interesting because it's one of our most recent mammal extinctions, the 30th mammal extinction in the last 200 years. And it's also one of our first species confirmed to go extinct because of climate change. It lived on an atoll in the Torres Strait, and that atoll was inundated due to rising sea levels that wiped out the last population. So officially, on the threatened species listing, we now have 91 species that have become extinct. However, there are actually more than 91 species that have become extinct. In 2019, a study was done to recount the extinctions that occurred in Australia, and this only included endemic species and also went through the listings for states and territories and globally to find out what actually had gone extinct in Australia. The recount found that 100 species have gone extinct in the last 200 years, rather than the 91 listed on the threatened species list. And again, this is dominated by plants, but also 34 mammals. This represents a quarter of the world's mammal losses in the last 200 years, making Australia the leader in mammal extinctions. Now, some species were rediscovered in 2019. So there's these 2 species of ferns. They were rediscovered on Thornton Peak and Mount Finnegan. The cowrie moth was rediscovered in Queensland. And another insect was rediscovered, the Keys matchstick grasshopper. This grasshopper used to be the most abundant insect in southeastern Australia, but has now declined and was extinct in Victoria until its rediscovery in a cemetery. The cemetery coincidentally protected a piece of grassy woodland area that was the habitat for the insect. Surveys along the northern coast of Australia found new populations of sharks and also discovered areas that had manta rays that were previously unknown. Moving on to another indicator. There have been water bird studies happening since the 1980s that help us understand the abundances and breeding behaviour of Australia's water birds. There's been a small increase from 2018 to 19, but this is still lower than the long-term average. And the breeding was concentrated to just one location and just straw-necked ibises. Another useful bioindicator are flying foxes. Flying foxes are helpful for understanding what's happening for other mammals because A, they're very easy to count, they live in large camps, and B, their stress from heat is really noticeable and easy to study. The spectacled flying fox was uplisted to endangered in 2018, and in 2019 it suffered further mortality events. There was a further mortality event in October in Queensland because drought reduced the food supplies for the bats. So the already reduced population from heat waves early in the year suffered later in the year due to lack of food availability. Citizen science can be helpful in revealing trends of species abundance and distribution, particularly in places where there isn't rigorous surveys carried out. One such species that's been reported on in 2019 was the crimson chat, a nomadic desert specialist which has this beautiful bright white and red breast. This makes them very easily identifiable and therefore a good species to trust in the observations that are put in citizen science databases. Crimson chats will also forage in mixed feeding flocks with other desert species, so what's happening to crimson chats may tell us about other species that are harder to detect. There was a large breeding event of crimson chats in May 2019 because of the floodwaters from Cyclone Trevor in the Lake Eyre Basin. And when the species abundance increases in the interior, then all of those birds spread out and move southward to find food resources. And we saw that in 2019 in the citizen science database. The grey polygons show the convex hull of where crimson chats were seen in 2000 to 2018. And in 2019, they moved much further south in Victoria because of the large numbers of crimson chats. This was the first eruption of crimson chats and therefore of other desert specialists into the central East Victoria since 1967 and 68. We'll take a look at what is probably the elephant in the room, the bushfire season. The loss of the Gondwana forest had been labelled a global tragedy. Some large mountain top arcs are meant to be permanently wet and have never burnt through, such as in Barrington Tops. And because of the lack of a fire history, a lot of the plants aren't adapted. For example, they have thin bark. Also, the Gondwana forests are usually a refuge for species. The Blue Mountains also burnt extensively, and the last big fire in the Blue Mountains wasn't since 2000 and 2001. Fortunately, some really important species, such as the Wallamai pine and the nightcap oak, were saved from the fire. So we still retain these important pieces of genetic diversity. A preliminary list has been drawn of the species that have likely been affected by the bushfires. This list includes 113 species. 52 of these species are already threatened. 61 of them have not been previously listed and may be threatened now. And 32 species has been provisionally listed. Whilst they weren't directly in the path of the fire, we don't yet know about some of the flow-on effects, especially downstream, quite literally. Most of these species in the provisional category are freshwater species. There are fears that the ash will choke the systems and impact our freshwater communities. And of course, koalas were affected by the bushfires. While koalas are listed as vulnerable in New South Wales and Queensland, they're not overall an endangered species and not at risk of becoming extinct in the near future. They're also not listed in Victoria and South Australia. In Victoria, they're overabundant in some areas and have to be actively managed. And in South Australia, they have been introduced to many locations because of historic demand for the fur trade. This includes places such as Kangaroo Island. In Queensland, there are currently 500,000 koalas, and the estimated number of koala losses was 1,000 individuals. So the fires did not severely impact koalas in Queensland. However, in New South Wales, 24% of koala habitat was burnt, and currently in New South Wales, there are an estimated 8,000 koalas, and perhaps 30% of them were impacted by the fire. But the major driver for koala losses in New South Wales remains land clearing. There have been concerns raised for the population of koalas on Kangaroo Island because they are a chlamydia-free population. However, there are other chlamydia-free populations, including in captivity. In summary, Australia's biodiversity in 2019 continued to decline, especially because of heat, fire and drought. And now I'll hand back to Albert van Dijk to summarise.
Summarising the year, we'll look at some key indicators of the environment. The ozone hole was 58% less than the previous 19 years. Ocean temperature was 0.09 degrees cooler than the 19-year average. Population was 17% more. Mean temperature was 0.85 degrees higher. The number of 35 degrees or more days was 36% higher. Rainfall was 40% lower. The amount of biomass burned was 24% higher. River flows were 43% lower. Wetlands were 26% less. Soil moisture was 11% lower. Soil protection was 13% less. Leaf area was 10% less. Plant growth was 17% less. Tree cover was 8% less. And the number of threatened species increased of 14% over 2000-2018 average. In summary, therefore, many environmental indicators showed a poor environmental condition. We also calculated a national environmental condition score by combining the relative scores of 7 component indicators. Those component indicators are the number of hot days, tree cover, soil protection, leaf area, plant growth, river flows, and wetland extent. National environment condition scores were the lowest since we started counting in 2000. The national condition score decreased by 2.3 points to a value of 0.8 out of 10. That is the lowest since at least 2000. Scores declined everywhere in Australia. There were the worst conditions in Northern Territory, New South Wales and Western Australia, but the greatest decline occurred in Western Australia. In all cases, this was due to dry and hot conditions. Conditions were relatively less bad in Queensland and Tasmania. In summary, overall environmental condition was the worst since at least 2000 and well below average in every state and territory. For more information on Australia's environment in 2019, visit our website. For further details or a report on the environmental condition of your own region, visit www.ausenv.online. You can find a summary report that documents everything you've heard so far. You can find report cards for each and every region in Australia. And you can find access to our Data Explorer, where you can look up data for any region in greater detail. Thank you for joining us today.